Legislature and Elections. My name is Cassandra Etienne. I'm Assistant Director at the Center for Cooperative Media, and I'm pleased to host this event today with Anthony Oni Avinkula, who leads our ethnic and community media initiative here at the Center. This panel is part of the Center's monthly press briefing series. We partner with some 150 ethnic and community media outlets throughout the state. And these press briefings reflect the Center's efforts to support these outlets in a number of ways, including facilitating access to newsmakers and government officials who can talk about these timely issues of concern to New Jerseyans. In just a moment, Oni will lead us in a discussion about the upcoming general elections in New Jersey, why these elections matter, and within that, efforts to make the state legislature more representative of New Jersey's demographics and communities. But first, just a few statistics, if you will, to keep in mind. Here in New Jersey, the population is 52% white and 49% male, yet out of the 120 state senators and assembly members who will make up the state legislature, about 70% or 84 of them are white, non-Hispanic, and 2/3 are men. When it comes to women, we make up roughly half of the state's population, but only 30% of its legislatures. Representation among Latino communities is also lacking. We have 8% representation in the legislature as compared to 22% of Latino residents in the state. And in the Asian communities, we have 2% representation in the state versus 10% in the state population. Black lawmakers comprise 15% of the legislature, which is relatively in line with the 12% Black population in New Jersey. All this is to say that while the ideal is that the New Jersey legislature does mirror its population, the reality is that we are far from it. And it may be too late to change who's on the ballot, right? But the role of journalism remains still pivotal, important here. Media has the power to call attention to emerging leaders and the laws affecting voter rights. Journalists can also help to demystify the democratic processes for diverse communities, making these processes more accessible for all. For our part at the Center for Cooperative Media, we're pleased to partner with NJ Spotlight to present the New Jersey Decides 2023 initiative. This is a resource that offers a comprehensive look at the races for all 120 seats in the state legislature. It's part of a statewide collaboration, a coalition of journalists led by the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University to collect candidate questionnaires from every person who's running for a seat this year. And you can check it out. We'll drop the link in the chat. There's also support available for New Jersey Commons members to contribute a series of stories about legislative elections across the state and key issues for voters. And please check out those resources. As I said, we'll drop the links in the chat. Lastly, I should note that today's event is being recorded and we'll have time at the end of the hour, about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. So questions from the audience, please drop your questions in the chat throughout our discussion today, and we'll do our best to answer them while we're in talks this afternoon. And wherever we don't get to, we'll try to get those responses to you after we end today's event. Thanks to our guests and our moderator, Oni, who we'll hear from shortly. And yeah, I guess with that, I'll turn it over to Oni to get us started with the conversation. Thanks to everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Cassandra, and welcome everyone to today's press briefing. My name is Oni Avinkula, and I am the Ethnic and Community Media Coordinator at the Center, and I will be serving as your moderator today. You will be hearing a brief presentation from both of our remarkable speakers today on this very timely subject, racial representation in the New Jersey Legislature and elections. I will introduce each of the speakers before their presentations. And with that, we'll start with our first speaker, Mikori Vargas, who will give us an overview of the New Jersey Legislature in terms of race and gender representation, population makeup and demographics, and more. Mikori is an associate counsel of the Democracy and Justice Program at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. She works with her team on projects that aim to protect and expand the right to vote including the promise of democracy for people of color across the state of New Jersey and the initiative to restore the right to vote to people with criminal convictions. Okay, so Mikori, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here today with all of you. As Oni mentioned, my name is Mikori Vargas. I'm an associate counsel at the Institute working in the Democracy and Justice program. In my role, I am engaged in vital voting rights work. So, today I hope to share with you some of not just, the power of the vote and how important it is to the essence of democracy, and the role of the media in expanding access to the ballot to many of the communities that we focus on in the Institute. The Institute is primarily a racial justice organization, and one of our key areas is democracy. So we've been working on several initiatives where the media has been instrumental in pushing some of that forward. For instance, in the past, we have worked with a lot of the media outlets in New Jersey to get the word out on several initiatives that we've passed, like ending of prison gerrymandering, also the restoration of the right to vote to people with on parole and probation. And that campaign is still ongoing, actually, and we will continue to work on restoring the right to vote to those who are currently incarcerated as well. But I am happy to talk more about specific. I just wanted to clarify, Oni, if I should just start talking more broadly about just what the makeup of the legislature, and then more specifically, like how exactly the media can help with bridging those gaps that we were alluding to earlier at the top of the conversation. Is that okay for me to start diving into, or should we?
Yeah, that would be great. Sort of like the foundational of this conversation.
Awesome, great. Okay, so to start, I just want to preface this by saying that the power of our vote is paramount to the very essence of democracy. When voter participation dwindles, our democracy's foundation weakens, leading to decisions that may not truly represent the collective will of the people. And this decline in turnout perpetuates inequality, disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities and resulting in policies that fail to address their pressing needs. Moreover, the accountability suffers when a significant portion of the population is disengaged, which we find here, and this is kind of the purpose of this conversation really, is like, why is this specific, Black and Brown communities, why are they so disengaged? And this is an issue across the country. It's not unique to New Jersey, but considering that New Jersey is one of the most diverse states in the country, with over 48% of its population being people of color, and we know from, the statistics that we heard at the top of the call that is not being totally represented in our legislature currently. This disparity highlights that the urgent need for equal and expanded access to the ballot, and the need and we need to work with our journalists to shed light on this disparity to serve as a beacon for change here in New Jersey. Some of the barriers that we see really, and as we're on the ground at the Institute, because at the Institute we believe that we firmly believe that change begins at the grassroots level, and that anyone can make a very profound difference in their own communities, but it's crucial to acknowledge the importance of every vote and our collective responsibility to strengthen our democracy. We still have a lot of the same barriers that have been plaguing us for decades, really. There are still disenfranchisement, suppression, accessibility issues. And in New Jersey, I would think, and I imagine, that the biggest issue to accessibility is language justice issues. It's related to the ability to get all this, we have such a diverse population. I think there were studies done about just, as an example, Jersey City has so many different languages and dialects are spoken in just one city in New Jersey. So you can imagine that this is an issue that is widespread throughout the state as well. And a lot of people who don't maybe speak the language are not receiving the same information as an English-speaking person in America, but also here in New Jersey. And I think it's incumbent upon us to, encourage civic engagement using the media to amplify some of these emerging leaders that we see. That there are some great, I at the Institute, we are 501c3, so we are nonpartisan, but we do recognize that there are people running for office currently. This year, we have one of the biggest elections in New Jersey. We have all 120 seats in the legislature up for election. Granted, a lot of those races are uncontested, and we see that it's the same players, but there are a significant number of people of color running for office in both parties. I was looking just at the NJ Spotlight website recently, and how you see in each district who's running for what, and you can, like, after you do some research, obviously it takes a little bit of time, but roughly, like, there are about 48% of the candidates running for the Senate are people of color, and in the assembly are also, there's about 60% of the candidates are people of color. However, that doesn't mean that those people will be elected to office per se, as was the case 2 years ago when the legislature had another big election. The turnout is different, at the end, because we are a democracy and ultimately the people have the power to choose, but it's also who is getting access to that information to make these choices or these educated decisions about who will be representing them and their best interests. And I think one of the things that we try to do at the Institute, and we try to work with our partners in the media, is how to inform the public about voter rights and highlighting underrepresented communities. And we try, even at the Institute, we try to demystify the democratic process, and we try to promote civic engagement by promoting voting and election information in different languages. Currently, we've just started translating almost all of our documents to Spanish. We would love to start translating all the other materials to other languages as well. But we started with Spanish as being one of the most spoken languages in the state, to increase voter education to a population that has been underserved and underrepresented in the state. For example, there are other ways that we can keep promoting increasing voter information in multiple languages. I think the media there's a great place for the media to tap into some of that voter education I was just speaking about, and informing the public about voter rights. For instance, there is currently there are two ways that I think legislations can help with this language barrier issue. One being, there's a language access bill that's currently up for a vote, and it's actually it's passed committee in the Assembly, and now we're trying to get it through the Senate. This is led by another organization in the state called the Alliance for Immigrant Justice. Their language access bill that they're spearheading is A3837 S2459. And this bill would require state government entities to provide vital documents and translation services in 15 of the most common non-English languages. So if we can uplift these kinds of policy changes through the media, this would, of course, help our communities get, if we can promote those, not just like to promote these bills getting pushed through, but what would happen once a bill like this gets passed is there would be an easier pathway for those who are currently underrepresented to get very vital information on not just democracy issues, other things as well, because These documents would, of course, include election and voting documents produced by state agencies and the County Board of Elections, but this would cover the gamut of all government documents. And I think to have one of the key things in order to have an educated electorate is to make all this information as accessible as possible. And now another way that we think will make voting more accessible to a lot of the larger population here in New Jersey who is currently being underrepresented is if we pass a strong New Jersey Voting Rights Act. We know that there is a federal Voting Rights Act that is currently being gutted. We've seen it more recently with some of the decisions that came out this summer. That wasn't a terrible decision, but just last fall, there were a few decisions that were concerning, that the cases were very concerning. And in 2013, when Shelby County Holder came out, it essentially gutted all of Section 5. So now all these states like New York and Connecticut have been passing their own state Voting Rights Act, and we hope to do the same here in New Jersey. A state level Voting Rights Act can include provisions that protect against voter disenfranchisement and suppression tactics. It would establish guidelines to ensure equal access to polling places and prohibit discriminatory practices and safeguard against measures designed to limit voter participation, which is key if what we want is to increase voter turnout for these underrepresented communities. I think this is another great space for the people in the media that are catering to these underrepresented communities to bring these kinds of these proposals to them. These are the things that our state legislature is currently working on, and a lot of the advocates have been pushing for in order to create a more inclusive democracy here in New Jersey. You know, of course, there is the issue of voter registration, and I think there is also not only is there a bill currently in the Senate and Assembly, it's for the same day voter registration, which would allow people to register to vote on the day of election, the days of early voting. This has been something that we've had in a lot of media outlets, but to be quite frank, I'm not entirely sure that some of this information is going out to these underrepresented communities that would most benefit from learning about things like same-day voter registration. I've personally gone to some of these neighborhoods that may not know about same-day voter registration, and because I speak more than one language, I'm able to communicate with some of the non-English speaking members of those communities, typically Spanish speakers, and they know very little about what is going on, because it's a different situation for a lot of these families. They're typically immigrant families and don't necessarily have the time to try to research this stuff, especially when there's very little out there on these issues that is accessible to them. And I think there is great value in just informing, just putting out voter information, and some of these policy pushes that advocates throughout the state are trying to get off the ground in multiple languages. And the Institute is happy to help with any of that work if it makes sense. But I think that's probably the best path forward, is addressing some of these language access issues, and in order to have a more informed electorate and more inclusive democracy where everyone feels that their voices are being listened to. And so that's all I have to say for now, and I'm happy to answer more questions.
Yeah, I actually have a couple of questions for you, but in the interest of time, let's give our next speaker, a chance to give his presentation. Next speaker is Thomas Varela, who is the founding executive director for the New Jersey Black Empowerment Coalition and separate a JBEC Action Network. Thomas will touch on the most pressing issues affecting communities of color that influence their voting decisions in New Jersey. He and his organization works at the intersection of policy, civic participation, and racial justice, educating key stakeholders and the broader public. So I have a couple of questions for both of you, but Thomas, this is your chance to give your presentation for about 5 minutes maybe, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Yeah, not a problem. And thank you for having me join this call. When I think about the issues that are most pressing in communities of color, when we think about those that are most marginalized or those that are trying to be successful here in New Jersey and across the country, I do find that these aspirations, these issues are pretty similar to all communities that have seeked the American dream. I think one of the challenges that we have to be mindful when we think about these issues is that it feels like in this moment, there is this feeling that America, and I say America more broadly, is trying to move the goalposts as to what does it mean to achieve the American dream. We know historically in the 30s and 40s and 50s, there was a willingness to see governmental policies and public policies be used to create the suburbs, to build generational wealth, to provide college access to returning citizens from World War II. There was a willingness to do those things in terms of using public dollars or government policies to help folks enter into the middle class. It does feel, unfortunately, as America is becoming more and more diverse, we're now changing the definition as to what does it mean to achieve the American dream. We feel less likely to make the same commitment, public investment in policies that will help move these Americans into the middle class, particularly those that are the most marginalized. And so when we think about the policy issues, I think, when we speak to other communities of color, in New Jersey, I think this is very prevalent. Individuals here are trying to achieve the American dream and are trying to achieve the same goals and aspirations that all immigrant communities have tried to achieve when coming to the United States of America, recognizing that America is a land of immigrants, right? So when we think about these policy issues, we're thinking about protecting our rights and protecting our existence. So, thinking about voter suppression and issues around our ability to express ourselves in the traditional American system of voting and civic participation. We think about protecting our health when we think about maternal health and how Black and brown women are dying at higher rates when they're delivering their child. So we're thinking about those issues. We're also thinking about policy issues that support our aspirations. Once again, our aspiration to purchase a home, to have access to quality education, to start a small business. Once again, those bedrock tenets of what it meant to achieve the American dream, that is not something that is different for marginalized communities. These are individuals that, whether they've been here from the founding of America or they immigrated here, everyone is immigrating to this new land to, lay roots and be successful and to achieve success. So, we think about economic inequality, access to healthcare, workers' rights, and also housing issues, climate change. There's a overall issues, but I think the other thing that we also have to keep in mind when we think about marginalized communities is the feeling of being uplifted in our policies, right? This feeling of policies that don't make us feel that we have to be so reliant on government, but that government is a support system as we achieve our goals individually. And I think that's important to note because, more and more marginalized communities, they recognize that government can be useful and they see the opportunity is there, but they still want that feeling of individual success or community success in terms of working with other individuals within their community to achieve whatever they are seeking to achieve. So I think there is that feeling of America supporting our aspirations and America protecting our existence. And I think that, regardless of individual specific bills and legislation, the overall feeling that communities of color are hoping to accomplish is that feeling of achieving that American dream.
Thank you, Thomas. Quick question for both of you. Representation starts with the candidates, right? What are the challenges you think that we have low candidates of color in terms of candidacy? What are the challenges that they face? Why they don't normally run for office?
Yeah, I think, naturally, I think there's some institutional systems that exist that can sometimes feel daunting for communities of color to enter in terms of the perception that it takes a lot of money to be a candidate, that it takes institutional support, institutional knowledge. So I think there's always those internal barriers. I mean, there's those perceptions that influence someone's ability to run for office. And I think navigating those systems can be challenging. I think, as we know, politics is something that some may feel is a dirty sport and feel less likely to be involved in the process. We also have to keep in mind for communities of color, particularly those that immigrate here, they experience government differently. They experience being a candidate differently. And sometimes those experiences may carry over into what does participating in government look like as in living in America. So we do have to keep in mind some of the not generational, but cultural differences that may exist when we think about a citizen's belief in running for office and its purpose and its validity.
Yeah, that's a part, definitely something I was going to touch on. I'm Latina. I know that for a lot of like the Latin American communities coming from certain countries, where they don't have very much trust in government, that's something that plays a part in it. And because they don't have access to information in the same way as an English speaker may have, they don't understand the gravity of certain situations or how the systems work here and how they may differ from government in their own country. However, I also think it's interesting here in our New Jersey legislature that one of the things at the Institute that we talk about is that we would like a full-time legislature. Right now it's a part-time, they're part-time and they have a small salary. It's very difficult for a lot of our Black and brown people in the state who, we know they face the disparity in income for them in the state for Black and brown versus white is pretty stark. So it's more difficult or very unlikely that a person of color or Black and brown person will run for office knowing that this can take up so much of their time, and how many jobs will allow them to take 2 days out of the week to go down to Trenton and work at, be in the State House and let's do a committee hearing and be there for votes every once in a while. Usually the people that can afford to do something like that and take that time out are people that, this is very like supplementary income to them. It's not much that they're making in a year, and it usually benefits their job somehow to be in the legislature, and it allows, they have that flexibility to be a part of it. Whereas I would imagine that, when you're working a certain, an hourly job, that's not something you can do very easily.
Yeah, and I would say, just to add, that issue of income also plays a role when we think about civic participation more broadly, right? Because when you have committee hearings during the day, you have to have a job that allows you the flexibility to go to Trenton to advocate. So thus certain communities may be less likely to do those advocacy tools, to do their advocacy. Attending meetings I know, for instance, when we look at school boards, one of the things that they've noted that post-COVID, that it has opened up the opportunity for more individuals to attend school board meetings because school boards have moved to virtual meetings. And historically, if those meetings were not virtual and they were in person, you had to have the time and the flexibility to go to the school board, to spend 2-3 hours at a meeting. And as you can imagine, that can take a toll if you don't have disposable time. So I think that's always something that does hurt when we think about civic participation more broadly, is that we find that the communities that have more income, and sometimes that income also creates an incentive structure that they now feel more invested in what's happening in their government because they own a home in their neighborhood. So now they're thinking about zoning and its potential implications. They have a small business in their neighborhood, so they're thinking about taxes and such. So there is a correlation between increased participation and the amount of money you make. And I think then that creates a challenge, because then the voices that are heard by the elected officials may be skewed towards individuals that have access or are participating, and thus the policies that we end up seeing being passed are reflective of that.
Mhm.
Thank you. We have a question from Moshin Zahir, who is the editor of the Urdu publication. It's the Urdu News. Moshin, I'm not sure if you are muted.
Yes, thank you, Ani. Thank you. So my question is for Mikari Vargas. So you talk about, and you give very interesting figure that 48% in Senate candidates in Senate race and 60 in Assembly race are people of color. Is that right?
Yeah, I did a cursory review of who is currently running, who's won their primaries for this year, and the very broad racial makeup of those candidates. I mostly focused on Black and Brown folks, and I know there are there's more nuance to that, but as there is a large percentage of people of color running. However, as I mentioned, it doesn't necessarily translate to that being our representatives coming January.
But does it mean that more and more people of color or communities are taking interest in electoral process?
Possibly. And I want to be careful with how I phrase this, because this is speculation. This is not fact. I would imagine that there are other interested parties at play that will maybe push certain candidates forward. It might reflect their goodwill, or they're trying to show that they're being more progressive. But it could be that these candidates are being run in areas that they know they're not going to win. Because that's usually how it turns out. It's in certain areas of the state that we have a general idea of how the populace is likely to vote. These candidates are being put forward. But I also want to maintain some nonpartisanship here.
All right, thank you.
Mikari, just for a background, could you provide like the key races featuring some of these candidates on state, Senate, and Assembly compositions? Where are they, the ones with candidates of color?
Of course, let me find that document. Pardon. Okay, so there are a significant number of candidates of color running in District 28 and District 29, for instance, and District 31, as well as District 20 and District 1. Some of these people are uncontested and have already been in the Senate or Assembly. But you'll also see some new faces running for Senate in, I think, district, and pardon, I'm so sorry for this. I'm looking, the names are all blurring together right now.
If you have like,
I just don't want to get into the specific candidates themselves, but if you do look at the District 28 and District 29 and 31, for instance, that's a predominantly people of color districts that are those are people that are either Black or brown running for office there. But maybe Thomas can shed more light on that since he's not entirely 501c3.
Well, today we are in the 501c3 capacity here,
Okay.
so I do want to share some of the same sentiment of the Institute. But I think one of the things we do want to keep in mind is that regardless of the results, I think what is important is advocates and organizers push these elected officials to leverage the research that they do or the lived experience that they have to pass legislation. Because we know for the most part, the assumption that one can make is if a person of color that is an elected official, they're going to bring their lived experience and their identity and maybe their advocacy as it relates to the bills that they propose and the work that they do. But there are also others that will have that identity but may not pass legislation that reflects that. So I think we have to always be mindful that our lived experience and our identity does not automatically mean that our policy proposal will match that. So at the end of the day, for advocates, for organizers, you have to continue to push these legislators that they may look like you or don't look like you. You have to push and educate them on our lived experience and what policies we need in order to achieve the goals that we have as organizers and as communities. So we want to really make sure that they are passing legislation that reflect the wills and the needs of a diverse New Jersey.
Thank you. We have this question from Jungwon Lee, who works for a Korea Daily in New Jersey and across the country. You touched on this, Thomas, and some of the pressing issues affecting communities of color. The question is, do you believe immigration issue will be a factor in the voting participation in New Jersey? Anyone, both of you can actually address this.
I think so. I think it depends. I know that the topic of immigration sometimes gets elevated during presidential elections or larger elections. So you don't always hear it come up on local elections, which in 2023, we have the state legislature races. But ultimately, the organizers will help to elevate the issue of immigration if that is something that is of a concern, because ultimately the state legislature can have a say as to what policies are proposed as it relates to immigration. So I think the onus will be on the organizers to elevate this issue if they feel that there's candidates that, if there are candidates that they believe will play a role in immigration. So I think, when we also think about immigration in a more broadly sense, there's the desire to bring these individuals into the fold and give them the understanding of the American system and encourage their participation. But we also know that some immigrants may come without a desire to fully be involved in the process, or just may not have that knowledge base. So we always have to remember that our first step when we engage with immigrant communities is not make the assumption that they understand the process, and that when we speak to them, we're speaking to them from the education perspective. And then once we can introduce them into the system more broadly, then we can begin to talk about candidates, and organizers will begin to push immigrants in one direction or another in terms of how they should vote. So I do think that it will always be an issue, because I know the organizers are uplifting the rights of immigrants and making sure that those issues are front and center.
I concur with everything Thomas has just said. I mean, I am curious to know more specifically, like, what about immigration? Is it what's happening at the federal level, or just more locally with us being a sanctuary state, and people's opinions on that?
I think the question was more on the local side. As we know, migrants keep coming in, into New York and now in New Jersey. Some of them probably will be housed. There was a conversation around it. Will be housed at the airport, in Atlantic City. Now it's all over the state. So this is more of a local issue, I would say, the question, the trajectory of the question.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. And everything Tom has pretty much said would pretty much fall in line with my answer here. I think that, yeah, of course, it's definitely going to be a factor in how people turn out to vote and like how passionately they feel about it. I think it's, especially in the advocacy community, as Thomas alluded to, this is something of very much concern. I mean, just recently in Atlantic City, there was a resolution that was going to be passed to, I guess, alleviate some of this new the migrants coming into the city of Atlantic City, and because of some very strong advocacy work, very quickly actually, the resolution was taken off the table that day. So this is something that the advocacy community, it's top of mind for them, and this is a part of their advocacy effort, and will likely be doing outreach to some of these, like I'm hoping some of these media outlets that are on this presser right now, but is definitely something that voters are thinking about.
Yeah, thank you. I have this question that was sent to me via text message, and I just want to read it. This is from our Spanish, one of the Spanish language partners in the state. Just to give specific comparisons in the past elections, have you seen any difference in the voting turnout among diverse voters when there are names of candidates on the ballot that they can relate to or resonate with their demographics and their backgrounds? It says here that in New Jersey, 16% of eligible voters identify as Latino, but in Bergen County alone, that figure is 19%. So the question was, in the last gubernatorial elections, the Latino turnout was so much lower than when it was in 2017. So this representation really affect voter turnout and participation, and how?
I think historically there's examples of that happening when we think about in 2008 with President Obama, when he ran, we did see an increase in African-American voters. And it actually has now, in my opinion, changed how political pundits actually talk about voter turnout. Because, historically, for African-Americans, they had like a certain consistent number as it relates to their turnout. When Obama was a candidate, that number spiked. And so now we have pundits that, when we look at the data post-Obama, the turnout for African Americans has dropped somewhat back to the norm. But because we have experienced what we had with President Obama, a lot of pundits and politicians will refer to that as African American turnout is dipping, when it's not, when the real answer is it was the fact that President Obama was a candidate that created the spike, and that the numbers have returned back to the norm. So I do believe that in certain instances, someone's racial identity can make a difference, but ultimately people are going to pay attention to the issues, because as we've noted, there are individuals that represent certain communities on both sides of the political aisle. So at the end of the day, people are going to pay attention to, yes, they're going to see they're going to identify with the individual, but they're all hopefully ultimately going to pay attention to the issues that these candidates are championing. and then make the determination if, regardless of who they are as an individual, will this person understand my lived experience, and thus will that person propose policies that support the goals and aspirations that I have as a voter.
That makes sense. I mean, that falls in line also with just not having that representation. If they, when voters see candidates that are, you know, representing their communities, they're going to naturally be more engaged with the process. You know, I would imagine that when there was an increase in turnout for Governor Murphy's first election in the Latino community, they may have felt more engaged in that moment. It could be that maybe the previous administration or, you know, the circumstances during that time of the election made them feel the urgency to be more engaged in that in those years. But now that, you know, we are in a different place than we were a few years ago when it comes to not just the federal, but just even at the state level. You know, and this is not just, I don't want to make this a partisan issue per se, but like they may, you know, it's just like, in order to have an engaged electorate, they need to see themselves, they need to see the issues that they care about being represented by the candidates that are running at that time. And I think, you know, President Obama did a great job of showing that he was listening to the voters. And I think that's a part of it.
And I think to also add, and something to keep in mind, as we think about communities of color, particularly communities if they are not consistent voters, that it's our job in the media, but then also, more importantly, our job as organizers and advocates to help demystify the political process and help kind of provide some context as to why you should be voting in all elections. As we know, there's a perception that the race this upcoming race will have low turnout. There's not the same media marketing, there's not the same money involved, there's not the same amplification. So the assumption is that you're going to have a low turnout. And so our job is to help emphasize that turnout should remain the same regardless of the election, because there's an actual science behind why candidates and campaigns communicate with certain communities. So if they, you know, the candidates will look at the data behind the scenes and then chart out a path as to, okay, we got to speak to those high super voters, as they call them, because they come out consistently, and it's actually cheaper for us as a campaign or a candidate to speak to someone who's a super voter versus someone who I have to convince to vote at first. And then on top of that, now I got to convince them to vote for me. So a campaign looks at that as two jobs. I got to convince them to vote, period. And I got to convince them to vote for me. And if a campaign has limited dollars, they're going to spend money on whoever makes it easier for me to do my job. So I think we have to communicate to our community why it's important to become a super voter, because that's how you get their attention as it relates to the candidates hearing from us as voters.
Thank you. Now, based on what you've been seeing, where are we heading? What are the new directions in terms of racial representation in New Jersey legislature? What are sort of the opportunities that we've been seeing that are on the ground that we're hoping, to happen?
Yeah, no, it's hard to kind of envision what that may look like, but I do find that I think, if communities are continuing to organize, I believe, as Jersey continues to be more diverse, there's the natural assumption that communities will figure out how to mobilize and organize in order to show their power in the voting booth. One of the things that we see in this upcoming election, that 12 of the 18 individuals who are leaving the legislature are white. Does that mean that all 12 slots will be replaced by people of color, or will all 12 slots be replaced by white individuals? I think we'll have to see after the election, right? But one of the things that we are seeing is that as communities are recognizing the ability to create change through the electoral process and through voting, hopefully organizations will continue to mobilize and organize and strategize to have representation in the legislature in both the Assembly and the Senate, because ultimately, and the change that we want, the issues that we hope to address within BIPOC communities, we know that policy is a way to address those changes. And once again, we've seen historically that done when we think about government and public investments changing the outcome and the generational outcome of communities in the 30s and 40s and 50s.
I would agree with all of that as well. And yes, I mentioned earlier that the New Jersey's population is increasingly more diverse, and I said 48%, and you know, arguably we're probably past that point anyway. It's just that the way that the ACS census counts certain populations, like the Middle Eastern, North African peoples, are counted as white in our census currently. But as we know, New Jersey has a large population of Middle Eastern and North African that are not being counted as a part of an underrepresented group in the census. So I would, you know, it's very likely that we're already a majority people of color state. It's just that that's how, you know, as the census and the data, that is what we say, because that's what the data tells us right now, as it's stated. But another thing that's interesting to see is that our younger population in New Jersey is even more diverse than the adult population. I mean, I would imagine it has something to do with some interracial families, but it's true that our younger people in New Jersey are much more diverse now than even just 10 years ago. So the state is for sure becoming more diverse and will continue to become more diverse. And as they become of age and able to vote, you know, that's a group that has a low voter turnout, but they're going to have a stronger presence and will be looking for candidates to represent them that represent their interests going forward.
And I guess to piggyback on that, while low voter turnout among youth is consistent across the board, New Jersey has had one of the highest youth turnout compared to other states. So it does speak to, while there's more work to be done, young people in New Jersey are paying attention to politics locally, and thus they have an opportunity to influence what the state passes in the future. And we know that young people think about politics differently. They think about engagement differently because of the lived experience. When we think about the youth over the last 10 years, they've experienced a lot, and that's going to inform them as to the issues that they want to pass or the issues that they want to see addressed. So I think ultimately it's really going to be critical as these young people become voting citizens, that we're equipping them with the tools and resources so that they can be even more effective and efficient with their advocacy.
Thank you very much. It's 2:57 on my clock. We have one last question. This is coming from Panda. Panda is the co-publisher of New Jersey Urban News. This question is, what role do you see ethnic media play in helping to communicate the need for more diverse representation in the legislature? And how do you feel we can help mobilize civic participation?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I think ethnic media can do is help to be seen as trusted messengers. I think we talked about with the internet, there's a lot of information out there, and some of that information can be deceiving. We know that campaigns are, specifically on a presidential level, they are figuring out ways to leverage celebrity and leverage the just vast ecosystem of social media to put out misinformation and disinformation. We saw reports from the National Urban League that highlighted how while foreign agents actually targeted African American communities with misinformation. In many cases, it wasn't necessarily to make individuals vote one party or another, but it was simply to encourage a sense of apathy. And we know that apathy is one of the biggest issues that plague voter turnout, because we can see previous elections, feelings like hope and feelings like fear actually can increase turnout, but apathy keeps people home. And so it's really going to be important for ethnic media to combat some of the misinformation that is being shared by foreign agents, and in some cases home agents that are creating the sense of confusion, creating the sense of apathy, so that it then keeps certain communities from participating. Because, you know, historically, marginalized communities have a reason to be somewhat frustrated with government because they've experienced government in a negative way. So there's already a healthy frustration. But we know that in America, participating in your government is the fundamental right as as an individual here. And thus, if there's media that is encouraging our non-participation, we as a community have to be skeptical. And so I think this is where our ethnic media can do a big role, is to continuously stress the importance of participating in the process, and more importantly, serve as a trusted messenger, so that as people are trying to do their research, they're not falling victim to misinformation.
Thank you. Nikori?
Yeah, so echo all of that. You know, it's specifically with the voter apathy thing, it's hard. I think this is an issue across the board. It's that the GOTV is not great, the get out the vote efforts, and we have so many uncontested races, for example. There's really no incentive to get out the vote. But, you know, there are things that, you know, before I get to like what the role of the ethnic media, something that I think would help some of that voter apathy is getting things like same-day voter registration passed. When people see that they can register and vote on the same day, it dispels that notion that the process is cumbersome or exclusive. And it would be so much easier for someone who, you know, may not have the ability to register 20 days before the election, and that's coming up in 4 days. The registration deadline is October 17. When people can see that they register and vote on the same day, it makes them believe that their vote does matter. And the same thing with why we need a Voting Rights Act. So by actively combating the discriminatory voting practices, we're fostering trust in the system and reinforcing the idea that their vote is significant. But like, so to the actual question about ethnic media and how you can play a crucial role in communicating this need for more diverse representation, you know, it's by what Thomas is alluding to, amplifying these underrepresented voices, educating and informing your audiences about the importance of diverse representation in government, and publish articles, host discussions, create content that explains why diversity matters, highlighting some of these success stories. You can also do some voter engagement promotion. You can put out some of the voter registration information that we at the Institute have. For example, I shared a link on the chat, then you can access where you'll find some of our voter information, both English and Spanish. And you'll see some of the questions at the bottom of the most commonly asked questions. And you can feel free to use that and translate that into the market that you're catering to when in your media outlet. You can also be advocating for some of the changes I highlighted at the top. You know, that we do need some of these bills passed to make it easier for people of color and other underrepresented communities to be able to vote. It will create more inclusive debates and dialogues, for sure.
Thank you. We actually ran out of time, and this is the case when we have really remarkable speakers and interesting conversation to talk about. We have a couple of questions that we're not going to be able to address, but we're probably going to email this to the speakers. But I just wanted to say thank you. I wanted to express gratitude to the panelists and the attendees, the participants. Thank you for all of you for the time and for wonderful insights that you shared with everybody. We will, I think it was already posted there, that we will share the recording after this press briefing. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.